So the typical advice that I would say on consistency that I just really, don't subscribe to anymore is this idea of consistency equals forced rigidity. Hello, and welcome to Working Your Way, the podcast dedicated to exploring the journey of authenticity in the workplace and discovering how to navigate it your way. I'm your host, Sandhya Sudhakar, and today is going to be a solo episode where I am going to be talking about the idea of consistency and how it applies or doesn't to creative work. Now, this week I spoke on a panel in a podcasting community that I'm a part of, and the panel was all about starting where you are if you want to start a podcast, what you need to start or what you don't need. And we talked about a ton of different topics, but one that came up was about setting goals and why you might want to start a podcast or how to consider if you should start one. And my answer, if you listen to this podcast, you can probably predict, was to really think about the things that you enjoy. And if podcasting is something that really excites you and brings you energy, then it might be right for you. And if so, you should also consider which parts of podcasting and the process that you're actually really excited about and which parts that you aren't. And one of the questions I was asked was about outsourcing, editing, and production. And I spoke about this with my podcast producer, Hayden, in episode 50. About how I decided to work with a production company versus kind of DIY. But it made me think back to when I started the podcast and really just my intentions about creating. And I wanted to share some thoughts around all of this that came up as I was speaking on the panel and thinking about this week, consistency in my actions and how I create. And also recently, I've been experiencing something pretty cool in my business. I've had clients find me pretty organically, and I've been kind of analyzing how and why that's happening. People who are a really amazing fit or interesting opportunities that I hadn't really thought of before that are just showing up in my inbox or setting up a meeting with me. And really, as I've been reflecting on it, it goes back to the work that I've been doing for the past 2 years to make sure that I have a presence, I guess, on the internet, on social media, that I'm representing myself well on my website, that I'm showing up in the ways that feel really aligned for me, and that the words that I have out there that represent me, whether it's on LinkedIn or my website or in podcast posts or in these episodes, represent the authentic person that I am and my approach to my work that might be unique to me. So all of this leads me to think that my consistency in creating over the last couple of years is really helping support my business and bringing me new opportunities. And so I want to talk about this idea of consistency and really kind of break down this traditional narrative that we hear around habits and forming habits and doing things consistently versus maybe a more authentic and a little less bro-y approach to creating and creative work. Now, I think this topic is especially important for creatives, for entrepreneurs, or really anyone whose work is fueled by energy and ideas rather than kind of more prescriptive deliverables that you might be working on. But I also think that even in the corporate world, this type of topic can apply to leaders who have to do more innovative thinking or long-term planning, because ideating is a really critical part of that work that you do to lead an organization and to create a business strategy. And so I've talked before about how entrepreneurship doesn't really fit into the Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 box of corporate work hours. And so you might consider this a riff on that idea in a way. I mentioned it in episode 74 about some things that I've learned since starting to work for myself and how kind of the old ways that I did things in my corporate work life just really don't apply in the same way. And one of those things was that not all hours are created equally. When I first started working for myself, I kind of just assumed that I would work 40 hours a week, that I would have a normal work week. And I really quickly realized that 40 hours is very different when you are thinking about 40 hours in a corporate environment where, I was upper middle management at best, but it was a lot of passive engagement for some of those hours, things like sitting in meetings that were, filled with updates, or participating only in parts of meetings, or working on kind of more administrative pieces of the business, versus 40 hours now is full-time, active engagement, thinking, planning, creating, working on client deliverables, talking to clients in sessions. That active engagement hour is very different than kind of a passive engagement hour. And I can't do 40 hours of that type of work. And so that insight for me has been really helpful. And it's one that I share with new entrepreneurs all the time, because I spent a lot of time feeling guilty for not working enough when I first started my business. And really, at the end of the day, it's a different kind of work. And so whether you are a creative, a creator, an entrepreneur, a solopreneur, a freelancer, a consultant, or you are in charge of these big picture ideas within an organization, I want to talk a little bit about consistency and how the way that we talk about it now for creative work, I think, is doing us a little bit of a disservice. So the typical advice that I would say on consistency that I just really, don't subscribe to anymore is this idea of consistency equals forced rigidity. Things like, I have to post every day on LinkedIn to have visibility for my business, or every day, if I'm a leader in an organization, my first hour is going to be think time. And I think this is a little problematic because it doesn't really account for how our energy can be cyclical, how our life can be cyclical, the realities of running a business. My schedule is not ever consistent from day to day now. And so to force myself into a box where I'm doing the same things every day actually just doesn't work for me. And so that leads to, if I miss a day of something, or I don't do something perfectly, maybe there's some shame around the imperfection, or a little bit of a feeling of failure because I missed a day or a week in this thing that I'm supposed to do consistently. And so I think that rigidity, while consistency does mean doing something regularly, that kind of forced rigidity leads to, whether it's some guilt or some shame or some, feelings around feeling like you failed and then giving up altogether, or kind of hitting a burnout because we're struggling to do something on some arbitrary cadence that isn't really helpful. I think the other thing about consistency, especially as it relates to like creators, and if we think about content creators today, is that it often leads us to follow someone else's plan. We may hear about a system that worked for somebody to create content or create work, and that they do it X number of days a week or X number of hours a day. And I think we can fall into this trap of assuming that what works for someone else might work for us. And copying someone else's blueprint honestly just kind of leads to frustration. It often leads to misalignment. The circumstances are just never going to be the same for you as they are for someone else. And so trying to build consistency around someone else's model is also something that can be attractive as an idea and unattractive in execution. The last thing that I want to say about the way we talk about consistency that I don't really agree with is that oftentimes we think, okay, if I post something consistently, I write something consistently, I meet X number of people every week, that it's going to lead to a certain follower count, or it's going to lead to a certain revenue, or it's going to get me to this end state goal of what I need in my business or of what I want in my creative work. And I think that is another place that things can go wrong, and it creates this kind of pressure to make you feel like you might be failing when, if I say I want to meet someone new every week and it's going to lead to me hitting a certain revenue goal in my business, I'm kind of setting myself up for failure because there's a lot in between there that I can't control. Am I meeting the right people? Am I meeting them at the right time? Are they going to convert into clients? What's the average revenue that I bring in per client? So those are all things too that I think, as we think about the outcomes of our consistency, oftentimes we might be trying to expect certain outcomes that are several steps away from the consistent action that we might be taking. So what to do instead? And I thought about this a bit, and I have kind of 4 core principles that I would say we can, use to rethink consistency and take a more authentic approach to it, especially when we're doing this ideating, innovating, creating creative work. So the first is focusing on what lights you up. And I know I talk about this a lot. I talk about energy management a lot, and it sounds really woo-woo, but at the same time, choosing actions and types of work that genuinely excite you can really help you do it repeatedly and regularly. Things that you might wake up and look forward to doing every day or every week or every month are going to be the things that you will stick to. And so energy is a really key signal here. If something feels heavy or draining, it's likely that you won't be able to sustain it for a long period of time. So focus on what feels energizing, what feels exciting, in some instances, what feels fun, and design whatever your consistency goals are around those kinds of activities. So a question that I would ask here is, what work would I do even if it didn't lead to immediate results? Now, the second thing that I would say, the core principle, is consider the impact that you want to have. Now, don't follow someone else's plan just because it worked for them. Your life and your circumstances and your value are unique. So define what impact feels really meaningful to you as you're thinking about what it is that you want to do consistently to build towards that, and build your version of consistency around that. This can keep our efforts really rooted in the type of work that we care most about, and a sense of purpose, and in the science of motivation, having that sense of purpose and fulfillment is a really important piece to sticking with something, rather than kind of chasing outcomes or comparison, or working on something that you see someone else has, but you don't really care about at the end of the day. And so the question I would ask you here is, what ripple effect do I want my work to create? The third principle is figure out your own rhythm. Life and business are cyclical. I always say this, and there are times when things are slower, or my energy is lower, or I feel less motivated, or I might have a lot of life stuff going on. And so there are going to be these seasons where we need to rest or focus inward or focus on life stuff. And there are seasons where we might be in a more high output place. Also, who you're working with and how you're working and where you're working can be a part of this too. So thinking about when you can be in those conditions that are really ideal for the work that you do best is going to play into what is the rhythm in which you would want to create. Is it daily, weekly, monthly? Is it batched at certain times of the year? Consistency doesn't mean doing the exact same thing at the exact same pace, the exact same day forever. It just really means intentionally choosing a rhythm that works for your life and honoring when it shifts, but kind of knowing yourself and knowing how you best operate can really help here. So the question I would offer you here around figuring out your own rhythm and designing around it is, when do I naturally feel most creative or energized? And how can I plan my workflow to that? The fourth and final principle I would offer is that we should set process goals and not outcome goals. Now, a lot of times when we're creating, it is to sell our art in some way or to influence somebody in some way. And you just really can't fully control outcomes like followers or revenue or the number of client inquiries that you're going to get, but you can control the actions that you take. And so when we think about setting goals based on the process, that can allow you to focus on what seeds you might be planting consistently without obsessing over when or how they are going to grow. Because at the end of the day, we cannot control that. And so, as I mentioned, I may meet someone new every week, but that does not mean it's necessarily going to pan out to a certain revenue goal or a certain number of client conversions. And so thinking about the process goals as meeting the person, building a relationship, working on your relational skills, maybe even talking about your business consistently, those are goals that you can control. So the question that I would offer you here is, what meaningful actions can I take consistently where the action is the accomplishment, not the potential outcome of that action? So I started out today by talking a little bit about this panel that I was on and reflecting back around my podcast, and I'm going to use that as an example here. So when I started Working Your Way, I really wasn't thinking about algorithms or download numbers or converting listeners into clients. In fact, it was one of the first things that I've done where I didn't have a very kind of specific business goal behind it. And I was really guided by what felt meaningful and energizing. And I made an intentional choice to not DIY the whole thing. I waited until I was ready to outsource the parts of this process, podcasting, that didn't feel energizing to me. And then I didn't feel like I had the energy to learn myself and do myself, or I didn't feel like the trade-off of my time was really worth it. And now I've learned a lot along the way. Over time, those seeds have grown in ways that I never could have planned for. But I started the podcast really thinking about what my intention to create was. And so, one, I focused on what lights me up. I knew that I loved having deep and reflective conversations and helping people better understand themselves. This was something that I was already doing all the time, having those kinds of conversations with my friends, with clients, with collaborators. And so starting a podcast where I was having conversations that help people reflect and better understand themselves seemed like a really natural extension of something that I already do all the time that brings me a lot of energy. And so it wasn't about forcing myself to do something new or different that I didn't want to do. It was actually creating a home for something that I already did and sharing that experience with other people. So thinking about what lights you up, what are things you already do that bring you energy, or things that you enjoy that you could turn into a consistent action that will, maybe help your business or your creative efforts. As I started the podcast, I also really considered the impact that I wanted to have. So when I started the podcast, I didn't set out to create, a top ranked show. Honestly, at that time, all the numbers were arbitrary. I had no idea even what is a good podcast, what's a good number of downloads, what's a top ranked show. I didn't think about it as I want to chase this kind of quantitative goal. My goal was to create a space where people could reflect and learn about themselves, talk about their careers, and I wanted to share tools and stories for others who may need a little help showing up authentically in their career to be able to listen and take away some resources, some inspiration. I was really clear on the impact that I wanted to make on the listener. I was less clear on the impact I wanted to make on the guest. I actually discovered that as I went, that was actually a really great reflective experience for them. But I started the podcast for the people that might be listening. And the impact that I wanted to make really helped me stay grounded in what mattered and thinking about doing this for that purpose versus chasing some arbitrary number of downloads. Now, my recording schedule has shifted over time, and it's depended a little bit on what's happened in my business, but I really have designed around kind of my own rhythm or figured out what my own rhythm is. So I started the podcast as weekly, and I would have a new guest every week. And then that became something that was a little harder to maintain. And so there were times where I ideated with my podcast team around different formats that I could batch record, where if I was going to be busier in my business, I could pre-plan some things or do a bunch of episodes at one time. And a lot of those I've done with a friend who came on as a co-host, because that was something that really helped me from an energetic standpoint versus just recording solo episodes. I was able to record and have a conversation with her and have a lot of fun doing it. And that ended up really helping from an energy standpoint. But I had to kind of figure out that rhythm. I had to figure out the rhythm of my creative energy, of my motivation, and also allow myself time to focus on other things, to focus on life things, to rest and recharge and get my creative spark back. So I've never really tried to force myself into this rigid, I always record on this day at this time. Instead, I've really leaned into those different rhythms and kind of followed the seasons of my business and my life and found ways to still make it a process that I can stick to. And changing the process and changing when and how I do things is part of how I've stayed consistent. And the kind of fourth principle around setting process goals and not outcome goals, I think for me, when I first launched the podcast, it wasn't, again, about the outcome. It wasn't about how many people would listen. I had no idea how many people would listen besides, maybe my mom and a couple of my close friends. And so setting a goal like that just felt so arbitrary. And I think at the end of the day, it's like, control what we can control, right? And so I think setting goals around the process, I could show up consistently for conversations. I could record or publish an episode every week, not even record every week. And I could share my ideas in a way that felt really authentic to me. Like those process goals were about the actions I was actually taking, not the outcomes of something that I couldn't control. And now, I can reflect back on that 2 years later. I've seen outcomes that have come out of it that have benefited my business with potential clients or collaborators finding me through the podcast. I've had people show up and come to me already knowing that they want to work with me because they connect with my voice or my approach or the values that I am aligned to. And so these ripple effects were just a product of showing up consistently, putting something out into the world. And part of my goal also was to just get over this idea of like perfection. And in the past, I've really thought through everything that I post on LinkedIn. I need to research every idea that I have and make sure it's original and word it perfectly and all of these things. And I knew that producing a podcast, publishing a podcast every week would actually just make me embrace the idea of good enough and put something out every week that I frankly just didn't have the time to go back and make perfect. And so that was also incredibly helpful in terms of like a process goal to get my voice out into the world. I was able to do that in a way that was consistent and enabled me to work through ideas or just test something out or throw it out into the world and just be okay with it. Okay, so let's talk about one other example here. Maybe you are an independent business owner. Maybe you're newly leaving corporate and starting your own thing. And maybe you're a freelance designer, copywriter, HR consultant, yoga teacher even, right? And you want to grow your visibility. You want to attract clients who really align with your work. So I think here's something that you could think about when you're thinking about what you could do consistently and how you can create. So one, focusing on what lights you up. Instead of trying to be everywhere all at the same time, start by noticing what you actually enjoy doing. Maybe you love creating short videos for Instagram, but you hate writing long, polished posts on LinkedIn. Or maybe you feel energized by hosting a monthly in-person workshop rather than posting something online. The key is to choose one or two visibility practices, one or two things you can do consistently that feel fun and energizing and don't feel like a chore. So really think about what brings you energy, what you enjoy doing, maybe some things that you do in your free time that you don't think are relevant to your business, but there could be a way that you could apply it there. Principle 2, consider the impact that you want to have. So here's where you get to ask yourself, what difference do I want my work to make in the world? Or what difference do I want my work to make for people? How do I want people to leave an experience with me or content that I create? How do I want them to be changed afterwards? So as an example, if you're a yoga teacher, maybe your impact goal is to create a sense of calm and connection for busy professionals. When you're clear on the impact that you want to make, it can become easier to kind of design your marketing activities in a way that feels authentic to you, or ignoring these vanity metrics like follower counts, because it doesn't matter how many people you reach, as long as you reach a smaller number of the right people and impact them in the way that you want. So it's important just to think about not following someone else's playbook here just because they seem successful, because they may be doing something that is leading to a totally different impact than what you really care about. Principle number 3 here, figuring out designing around your own rhythm. You don't need to show up every day to be consistent, first of all. There's a woman, Tanya, that I know that does LinkedIn posts, and she calls her program Lazy on LinkedIn. And it's about posting once a week, but like having a high impact post, right? So that's an example of not following the advice of what, maybe a kind of more rigid consistency might look at, but instead experiment, find a rhythm that fits your life and fits your energy. Maybe you post 3 times a week for a few months and then take a week off and see how it goes. Or maybe you decide you just want to post once a week, but you want to do them all at the very beginning of the month and just have them ready to go. Or during a busy client season, you might focus on something else altogether. Your rhythm can change as your business grows, and the goal really is to create a pattern that supports you instead of burning you out. And so think about when you feel most creative, when you want to create, how you want to create, what are the conditions around the creative work that you do, where would you want to sit, and who would you want to be around? And then you can think about, do I want to do things on a consistent cadence? Do I want to batch things and have them show up consistently for others? What works for you? And now the 4th and final principle, setting these process goals, not outcome goals. So instead of really focusing on results like I need 5 new clients this month, things that you can't control, focus on the actions that you can. So as an example, maybe you do want to commit to attending a new networking event every month, finding something where you think maybe your ideal clients might be. Or maybe it's posting a behind the scenes video every week, just talking about the work you're doing with client, or sending out an email newsletter once a month. Thinking about the process goal being the actual action versus by doing this, I'm going to get to XYZ. I'm going to get to a certain follower count. I'm going to get to a certain client count or a certain revenue count. Those are things that we can't control. And so building consistency also looks like rewarding yourself for taking those consistent actions. They're going to help you build momentum. And you might not know exactly what the results of those are going to be. But the thing is also, sometimes you might start to see outcomes that you never expected. I did not expect to have clients come to me with new opportunities that I never really considered because they found me because of my consistency and putting my thoughts out into the world. So these results can happen really naturally when you keep showing up for the process and doing work that really energizes you and not trying to control outcomes that we just don't have control over. So just to wrap it up here, some practical steps that you can take. One is, what actions bring me energy and excitement? What makes me feel fulfilled? What lights me up? What do I want to do on whatever cadence it is that I decide to do it? 2 is, what impact do I want my work to have? And focusing on that versus something that seems a little arbitrary, like a follower count. 3 is, what natural rhythms or cycles do I notice in my life and creativity? When can I maximize my energy? What kind of creation cycle works best for me? And 4 is, what process goals can I commit to independent of the outcomes that may come out of them? So I want to refer you back to a couple of episodes if you're enjoying thinking about this and just want a little more creative inspiration. My friend Sam Parvin and I had a conversation about her career in episode 27. It was all about creating harmony in your work and life. And we talked about creativity and creative energy. We even talked about female menstrual cycles and other ways that we can tune into the different types of energy that we have at different times in the month. And so you can listen to that for a little inspiration. Episode 55 was with my friend Virginia Martinez. We talked about going beyond New Year's resolutions, but we talked a lot about setting goals versus setting intentions and how we can align actions to our goals. I mentioned episode 50 with Hayden, my podcast producer, that was kind of reflecting on the first year of Working Your Way. If you want to hear a little bit more behind the scenes of why I started this podcast and where I was creatively when I did it. And then last but not least, episode 74, which I mentioned at the top of this episode. And this is all about what you need to know if you are going to go work for yourself. And in that one, I reframed some ideas about success and productivity that were things that I learned as I went from corporate into independent work. So I will leave you with this message in closing that consistency isn't about rigidity or perfection. It's just really about showing up with intention for the things that truly matter to you and trusting that the seeds that you plant will grow in their own time. And especially if you're doing something that brings you a lot of energy and really lights you up.